A Nation is Born in Tears, 1965. It is August 9th, 1965. Singapore's Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, sits before a national television camera. His voice trembles. His eyes fill with tears. Singapore has just been expelled from Malaysia. The young nation had joined Malaysia only 2 years earlier. But deep tensions were growing. Malaysia's leadership feared Singapore's Chinese-majority population and its rapidly growing port economy. Kuala Lumpur worried that the tiny island could one day outshine the mainland itself. So Malaysia made a decision that shocked the world. Singapore was forced out. For Lee Kuan Yew, the moment felt like the end. Singapore depended on Malaysia for half of its water. Nearly 90% of its food crossed the causeway from the mainland. Without Malaysia, Singapore seemed doomed. At the time, the island was little more than a crowded, impoverished port city. 3/4 of families lived in shacks or squatter settlements. Many homes had no running water, no toilets, and no electricity. Public standpipes served entire neighborhoods. Ethnic riots between Chinese and Malays had recently left bodies in the streets. Singapore looked less like a country and more like a failed state waiting to collapse. Yet the man crying on television that day refused to surrender. Those tears would mark the beginning of one of the most extraordinary national transformations in modern history. After the announcement of independence, Lee Kuan Yew disappeared from public view for weeks. He retreated to Changi Cottage, exhausted and overwhelmed. He struggled to eat and sleep. Singapore had no army, almost no natural resources, and powerful neighbors that could easily threaten its survival. But Lee knew one thing: Singapore had to be recognized by the world before it vanished. Within weeks, he pushed the tiny island into the United Nations, securing international recognition. At the same time, the region around Singapore was dangerous. Indonesia was already engaged in a violent campaign known as konfrontasi, opposing the formation of Malaysia. Earlier that year, Indonesian commandos had bombed McDonald House in Singapore, killing civilians and injuring dozens. The attackers were captured and sentenced to death. In Indonesia, they were treated as heroes. Executing them risked diplomatic crisis. So Lee Kuan Yew traveled personally to Jakarta and laid flowers on their graves. Soon after, Lee helped form a new regional alliance, ASEAN, bringing together Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. For the first time, Singapore was no longer completely alone. Security came next. When the British began withdrawing their military forces from the region, Singapore suddenly faced the possibility of standing defenseless. In 1967, Lee introduced national service, requiring young men to serve in the military. To train the new army, Singapore secretly worked with Israeli military advisors, who helped design the doctrine of the Singapore Armed Forces. Within a few years, thousands of trained soldiers stood ready. Lee's philosophy was blunt. If Singapore could not defend itself, no one else would. With security slowly stabilizing, Lee turned to the greatest challenge inside the country: race. Singapore's population was divided between Chinese, Malays, and Indians, and violent clashes had erupted before independence. Lee declared that the nation would be multiracial and multilingual. 4 official languages were adopted: English, Malay, Mandarin, and Tamil. English would serve as the common language connecting everyone. Lee attempted to engineer national unity through language and policy. Even with stability, Singapore's economy remained fragile. Factories were scarce, jobs were limited, poverty was widespread. To solve the problem, Lee turned to Dutch economist Albert Winsemius. His advice was simple but controversial. Forget ideology, forget nationalism. Make Singapore the most attractive place in Asia for foreign companies. Lee followed the plan. Taxes were kept low, corruption was crushed, stability was guaranteed. Factories began rising across the island. Major multinational companies, including Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, and General Electric, opened operations in Singapore. The strategy worked. Foreign investment poured into the country, transforming it into an industrial hub of Southeast Asia. Economic growth allowed Lee to tackle another massive challenge: housing. In the 1960s, most Singaporeans still lived in slums.
The government massively expanded the Housing Development Board, constructing hundreds of thousands of apartment units. Families moved from crowded huts into modern flats with electricity and running water. To finance this transformation, Lee expanded the Central Provident Fund, requiring workers to contribute around 20% of their wages into national savings accounts. The funds helped finance housing, infrastructure, and national development. At the same time, corruption was treated as a national threat. Even high-ranking officials were not immune. Lee also wanted to transform Singapore's image. He launched the Garden City campaign, planting trees along highways, cleaning polluted rivers, and building parks across the island. The goal was more than beauty. Clean streets and green landscapes would signal to investors that Singapore was disciplined, organized, and modern. At the same time, strict laws enforced order. Littering, vandalism, and drug trafficking were punished harshly. Chewing gum was banned. The government tightly controlled the press and political opposition. Lee believed stability and discipline mattered more than unrestricted freedom. By the 1970s and 1980s, Singapore was expanding rapidly. The government built Changi Airport, which quickly became one of the best airports in the world. The Port of Singapore grew into one of the busiest shipping hubs on Earth. Singapore Airlines became a global symbol of luxury and efficiency. The city-state evolved into a major center for finance, technology, shipping, and trade. Foreign investment continued to pour in. Singapore had transformed from a struggling port into one of Asia's most dynamic economies.